Thank you to everybody for joining today's webinar on the latest installment of the U.S. Energy Employment Report, or USEER. We're especially appreciative of everybody taking the time to join today as we face this unprecedented public health and economic crisis rolling across the country. I think it makes the report particularly valuable this year, and we'll address more of those issues later. I also want to thank the Energy Futures Initiative, BW Research, and the many private sector, foundation, and state funders that have joined together to create this year's USEER, as well as the survey respondents that took time to provide the data that makes the report possible. I want to especially thank the Energy Futures Initiative's Secretary Moniz, Melanie Kinderdine, Joe Heiser, David Foster, Jeanette Pablo, David Ellis, and Natalie Volk for their great partnership over the last several years to make this report possible, and also just for the tremendous support they've seen in maintaining the quality of this work. Also at BW Research, the real muscle behind getting the survey work done and pulling the data and analyzing it, Phil Jordan, Ryan Young, and Sarah Lehman. Also, our partner, Karen Wayland, who has helped NASIO in many ways in pulling this report together and coordinating some of our activities, and in particular, NASIO's Sandy Fazeli, who has led all of the efforts on behalf of the state energy offices and NASIO in our work with EFI and BW and our other partners. I'd also like to call out our state energy office funders. They've stepped forward, as did states last year, to help provide support for this report along with our private funders, but I wanted to call out Texas, Pennsylvania, Vermont, New York, California, and Rhode Island in particular this year. They'll make great use of the data, as all of you will, and we thank them in particular. A few words about NASIO I wanted to convey so that in case you aren't familiar, we represent the 56 state and territory governors, energy directors. That includes the 50 states, the territories, and the District of Columbia. The energy directors support their governors along with their 3,000 plus staff in the state energy offices in developing energy policies and programs across every energy sector, production and end use. So solar, wind, nuclear, petroleum products, biofuels, and major end use sectors and innovation sectors such as electric vehicles, transportation, manufacturing efficiency, buildings programs, codes, etc. They also support important workforce development activities at the state level in the energy sector. This is why NASIO is involved to help support our members, help support the private sector, and the important job development, workforce development that needs to occur. They use this data from the USEER in order to inform incentive programs, workforce development activities, to target strategic industries, and work in partnership with the private sector and the federal government. I also want to commend two governors in particular, Iowa Governor Reynolds and Colorado Governor Polis, who partnered to write the foreword for this year's USEER report. Their message, which will be available soon, is a great testament to the kind of practical energy solutions that they're delivering in their states, and they do set a great example for the entire country. I also want to note today's USEER data has even greater urgency. Many of us will soon be thinking, especially in the policy sector, about how we help bring back thousands, if not millions of Americans to work after the COVID virus passes. This is a major crisis, and I think on a related note, many of our energy offices have utilized this data in the past to target strategic industries from an energy security perspective. So a lot of good value in the data that we'll hear about today. Finally, I think it's worth noting that this year's data marks the 5th year of the USEER. This allows for trend analysis and other opportunities that'll better inform workforce development activities across the board. Our presenters will tell you more about what they found, and I'd like to turn it over to David Foster, Distinguished Associate at EFI now to do that. David?
Thank you very much, David. We at EFI greatly appreciate our partnership with you and Sandy and the rest of the folks at NASIO, as well as your state offices around the country. Before I get started, a couple words about the Energy Futures Initiative. We are a nonprofit think tank with a focus on solutions to the climate crisis, especially important today by building coalitions, our thought leadership, and evidence-based analysis. You can see our leader, former Secretary Moniz, at the top of the employee list. His contributions enormously important. Natalie, if you go to the next slide, if you go to the Energy Futures Initiative, you can see the many reports that our group has already produced, in addition to the now 3rd edition of the U.S. Energy and Employment Report. please go to the website energyfuturesinitiative.org, download them all for free, and you can see some of the things we're concerned about. Next slide, Natalie. Now, I'm sure that some of you are wondering about the utility of a webinar on labor force data from 2019, when, as David Terry has noted, the economy that we're apparently headed into may bear no resemblance to last year at all. But it's precisely for times like this that we designed the first USEER 5 years ago, because we need to understand the job potential, the job results, the training obstacles, and the skills demand of our energy sector. And most importantly, I think we established through this data collection project an understanding of how and why the energy and energy efficiency sectors have consistently outperformed the rest of the economy in terms of job creation for the last 5 years. So when we think about economic recovery, what we've learned about the energy and energy workforce system is of paramount importance. So with that, by way of introduction, next slide, and let's get into the 2020 report. Quick reminder, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the methodology as we have in some of our past webinars. Happy to talk about that at the end if any of you have any questions. But the data we gather is based on an annual supplemental employer survey. It's coordinated then with BLS data. We look at 5 specific sectors of the economy: fuels, electric power generation, transmission, distribution and storage, energy efficiency, and then the motor vehicle sector. And just so that we're all speaking the same language, those first 3 we refer to as the traditional energy sector. Next slide. So this survey goes out to about 30,000 representative employers across 53 different technologies, spread across, for those of you who are labor force data geeks, 186 different NAICS codes. And it goes into a lot more than simply the employment numbers. As you can see enumerated there, we look at employer hiring expectations, difficulty, identifying high demand jobs and skills gaps, and workforce demographics. Next slide. So as we did last year, we've made a few updates and changes. One of them hasn't been completely completed yet, as David Terry mentioned. Our governor's introduction this year will be done by Governor Reynolds of Iowa and Governor Polis of Colorado. This year, we again did some spotlights into real-world experience, which we think is going to be all that much more important given our current circumstances. So we did interviews with Tesla, with the Center for Energy Workforce Development, Xcel Energy, and 3 labor union partners, the sheet metal workers, the United Association, and the United Auto Workers. We also added an in-depth look at Energy Star-related jobs. We had a very productive partnership with the Energy Star program over at EPA that allowed us to do that. We asked questions about utility-run energy efficiency programs, and then we added a summary chapter of 5-year trends. Next slide. So what are the key takeaways from 2020 U.S. Energy and Employment Report? Well, first off, in the traditional energy and energy efficiency sectors, we added 120,000 new jobs in 2019. As I mentioned, again, outperforming the economy as a whole for the 5th year in a row by 0.6 of a percentage point. Jobs increased by 1.8% when the overall economy increased by 1.2%. Energy efficiency led the way with 54,000 new jobs, so that's almost 330,000 new jobs in just the last 4 years. Fuels production grew significantly, adding 26,000 new jobs. 18,000 of those were in oil and natural gas, while coal mining held firm. Solar jobs, importantly, bounced back, adding almost 6,000 jobs after declining for 2 years in a row. Low emissions natural gas, wind, combined heat and power, and geothermal all continued to grow in the electric power generation sector. However, coal generation dropped by almost 8,000 jobs, even though coal mining itself increased slightly. Motor vehicles, in spite of the motor vehicle upsurge for so many years, added another 20,000 jobs, although the alternative fuel vehicle sector declined slightly. Overall, the hiring difficulty continued to rise, something we've tracked over the last 5 years. Now 84% of all these employers say it was difficult or very difficult to hire qualified employees in 2019. Overall, surveyed employers were still predicting healthy growth at 3.1% for 2020. Next slide. So here's an overview of where we stand with the actual numbers of jobs. If you add in the motor vehicle sector, those 5 produced 140,000 new jobs. As I mentioned, 120,000 in the traditional energy and energy efficiency sectors. Fuels production now employs 1.15 million. Electric power generation overall gained 21,000 jobs for just under 900,000. Transmission, distribution, and storage, 2.4 million. I want to remind you that's when you do include the roughly 1 million people who work in gas stations. Added 17,000 new jobs. 2.38 million work in energy efficiency. And finally, in motor vehicles, just over 2.5 million people work in the motor vehicles industry. Of that, a little over 10%, 266,000 work with the alternative fuels vehicles. Next slide. So a quick overview of each of these 5 sectors and some of the things that we noted. While jobs were growing in the fuel sector, that growth slowed by about half from what it had been the year before. Most of this, as mentioned, was in oil and natural gas, which collectively added 18,000 new jobs. Coal, a little less than 1%, but added 600 jobs for 75,400. Biofuels was a split experience. The biofuel side increased by about 2%, while corn ethanol jobs decreased. Employers expected modest growth in 2020. Next slide. In the report itself, we break down each of these main technology sectors in 2 ways. We look at both the industry sector that make up these categories of jobs, and then we look at the dominant technologies that each of them have. So for instance, in the fuel sector, we look at how many of the jobs are in mining and extraction, how many are in manufacturing, how many are in professional services, and so forth. Then we also divide them the other way by the prominent technologies. So in this case, petroleum, natural gas, coal, corn ethanol, woody biomass, and so forth. And that way you get a good look at what the actual skills needs are through the industry sector, as well as what the focus of the content or the technology of the job is in the other way that we divide them. In this particular case, we highlighted Chris Riley, the manager of workforce development at Tesla. It's a significantly interesting story because, as he observes in his interview, as a state, Nevada has a rich history of gaming, tourism, and mining. But the recession following 2008 created a significant focus on diversifying the economy to include industries like advanced manufacturing and data center technology. So a particularly cogent story that Chris tells about how Tesla played a role in the recovery from the Great Recession and the role that energy and technology played in that. Next slide. Moving on to electric power generation. Here the job growth was significant compared to the slight decline in 2018, added 21,000 some jobs. But what's most interesting about the electric power generation is the degree of change that's going on inside the technologies of that overall category. So advanced and traditional natural gas, we look at each separately, added the most jobs combined at over 9,000, while as mentioned, majority time solar added 5,700. Other technologies that grew included wind, combined heat and power. But the generation mix, as you can see, has really changed dramatically in the electric power sector. Net electricity generation from natural gas increased by 86% over the last 12 years. while net coal generation declined by 42%. And that's really the driver behind the decline in coal generation by almost 8,000 jobs in 2019. So the electric power generation employers do anticipate a fair amount of growth in 2020, with most of that expected in renewable construction. Next slide. And so once again, you see we divide up the workforce by both industrial sector and by technology. You can get all the details on that in the report. And we interviewed MJ Horner, who's the Senior Director of Talent Strategy and Transformation for Xcel Energy. Again, a very important interview in the context that we're seeing a lot of churn and technology in this sector. As she observes, how we manage this transition is very important. We know that there will be fewer power plant jobs in the future, but more jobs with data and grid management and customer service. Next slide. Moving on to transmission, distribution, and storage. We don't look at the gas station employment in the report. We look only at the non-retail employment, so almost 1.4 million workers there. As I mentioned, increased by 17,800 new jobs. There's been very steady growth in transmission, distribution, storage over the last 5 years, and something we'll say a little more about later on in the report, but certainly something that when we're looking at economic recovery, these are investments that always produce good, solid employment. Next sector, next slide. And here we did an interview with Missy Hendrickson, who's the new Executive Director of the Center for Energy Workforce Development, one of the really best public-private labor management partnerships out there in the country that is focused for the last dozen years or so on workforce issues within the utility sector, doing an excellent job in recruitment of veterans and a variety of other subsectors of the workforce, training camps, and a whole wide range of technology issues. So as we're looking at how to get America back to work, there are a lot of very practical lessons to be learned from CEWD. Next slide. Energy efficiency, of course, has always been the superstar of the U.S. Energy Employment Report in some regards because of the very large job growth. Every year we put this report out. Energy efficiency has created the most new jobs. That continued to be the case in 2019. Construction added 27,600 jobs, and professional services, a very important part of energy efficiency work, almost 15,000. Employers in the energy efficiency sector continue to have very robust growth expectations, albeit the extreme difficulty they've had in hiring. So that's an important theme of what we've learned through gathering this data. Next slide. And here we highlighted the Chief Assistant to the General President of the Sheet Metal Workers Union, Mark Norberg, talking about how the apprenticeship programs work to bring people into doing this very important energy efficiency work and the changes that they've gone through. On the left side of this slide, you'll also see another kind of chart that we put in the report to enable people to better understand the exact breakdown of every single technology in terms of the different kinds of industrial sectors that the jobs fall into. So in this particular case, when you get a chance to look at the actual report, you can look at how high efficiency HVAC systems break down into a certain number of people who are doing the construction work, a certain number doing manufacturing, those that are doing the professional services, and so forth, and gives you a much better sense of what it is and who it is that gets the job done so that we can introduce these new technologies into people's lives. Next slide. As I mentioned, we did a special sector on the Energy Star program inside the EPA and how it has impacted jobs in the American economy. And through this extensive survey and collaboration with EPA, and I would be remiss not to give Beth Conlon over there a shout out for all the great work she did on this. We determined that almost 827,000 employees in the United States are involved in the manufacture, design, installation, wholesale distribution, and other services for Energy Star. And that's pretty impressive considering that Energy Star automatically only certifies a certain percentage of any kind of product or process. It isn't something that you can get 100% performance on. So a very significant impact on the economy. You can see at each of these Energy Star rated kinds of products, whether the jobs are in construction, manufacturing, professional services. You'll see that HVAC systems made up the most, 34% of those 827,000 jobs, followed by LED lighting and appliances. In terms of industries, the lion's share of them, over 500,000, work in construction, but almost 150,000 work in professional services. Next slide. Finally, the motor vehicle sector, as I mentioned, I think those of us who've been around for a while are surprised at this very long growth spurt that the U.S. automotive industry, motor vehicle sector has enjoyed over the last decade or so, but added another 20,000 employees to up over 2.5 million. Alternative fuels vehicles now, as I mentioned, employ 266,000, which represented a slight decline. But I would encourage you, when you see the report, that we did a revision of the last 4 years worth of alternative fuel vehicles data, which provides a little more accurate picture of the big drop-off that we experienced 2 years ago. It wasn't quite that bad, and so consequently the growth that we enjoyed in the subsequent year still leaves us at a relatively high point. Finally, in terms of fuel economy, 44% of employees in the auto parts sector, that's almost 500,000, are working with products that contribute to fuel economy. Next slide. And in this sector, we highlighted the legislative director of the United Auto Workers, Josh Nasser. As he pointed out to us, job quality is very important to maintaining the middle class in America. Over the last 15 years, pay in auto jobs overall declined by 20% when adjusted for inflation. That's what was so important about last year's auto negotiations. We need to improve job quality if we're going to restore equality. No pun intended. Next slide. We take a snapshot look at what's going on in low carbon emissions energy. 834,000 Americans are employed in that sector. When you divide it up that way, we break that down into the different technologies. You can see low emissions natural gas is there, for instance. They experienced the largest percentage growth last year, 9.4%. And you can see the kind of mixed results in the fuel sector, where corn ethanol decreased slightly, but other sectors all rose. Wind, I might point out, has been the kind of steady growth champion during all these years, added another 3.2% last year. Next slide. We also take looks at what the different occupational sectors look like in their whole. It's always been interesting to me to note that the construction industry, which employs about 7.5 million people in the United States, that virtually 30% of those employees are involved in our energy sector. The largest portion of them are in energy efficiency at 1.3 million. But 500,000 of those jobs are in the infrastructure side, the transmission, distribution, and storage, another 300,000 in electric power generation. And these construction firms consistently in our reports have shown the greatest difficulty in hiring throughout the entire survey. So that's an important note to think about job training. This has consistently been an area where employees who get trained get hired and get paid well. Next slide. We highlight professional services because this is really one of the fastest growing although not the largest sector in energy, but it's one that really, in many ways, represents the future. As technologies change and become more and more reliant on data management, this is where we're seeing the growth in professional and business services throughout energy. And you can see they're spread through the traditional sectors in large numbers, but then really take off with 500,000 jobs in energy efficiency. Next slide. And finally, it's good to note that energy is something that touches manufacturing as well. 771,000 jobs are directly producing the equipment that's used in the energy sector, whether it's OCTG pipe for oil and gas drilling, or whether it's the manufacture of wind turbines and solar panels, or whether it's the making of all these energy efficiency products. As I mentioned, there were almost 100,000 energy efficiency manufacturing jobs in the Energy Star program alone. Next slide. We also updated our crosscuts. We found those helpful and introduced them last year so that people had a better understanding of the full value chain of employment that exists in a lot of these industries that we think of sometimes only in segments. So we get a chance to look at natural gas from the point of view of it being an important fuel, of it being a source of electric generation, of it being a heat source that is fed to domestic and industrial residential customers. When you look at all the different ways in which natural gas is used in our economy, you find out that it actually employs over 635,000 people. The same is true when we look at coal. Some of us might think of coal only as a mining job or related to mining, but when you add in the generation and the distribution jobs that go along with that as well, it's 185,000 people. Next slide. Not going to go through all the crosscuts, but we did one for the nuclear industry as well. We provide these heat maps to show where the concentration of jobs are. You know, here you can understand why nuclear power plants are so important to the communities that they reside in. They are generally in more rural locations, and they provide the best paying jobs, as you'll see in the small box, within the entire energy sector. Next slide. As I mentioned, we do hiring difficulties for all these individual technologies. The big takeaway this year is that 84.4% of all surveyed employers reported difficulty hiring qualified employees over the last 12 months. That's up from 76.9% the year earlier. The same percentage, 29%, said that it was extremely difficult. As you can see, we go through and identify technologies and occupations with the highest hiring difficulties, and we look at the highest demand occupations, by example, in this slide, in the energy efficiency construction sector. And those do change year over year. I remember that last year it was electricians that were at the top of that list. Next slide. So finally, the hiring rates that were projected for next year. These obviously are aspirational at a different time, but you can see they ranged from 4.8% in the electric power generation down to 1.7% in fuels. Next slide. And finally, we do look at workforce demographics. What we've discovered is that the energy sector, in many sections of it, is racially more diverse than the workforce as a whole. You can see some of the overall summaries there. This goes into great detail in each individual technology in the report. Women continue to be significantly underrepresented in the energy sectors. Veterans do make a higher percentage of this work than they do in the workforce nationally. In part because of the very serious recruitment efforts that go on by quite a number of these employers. And finally, unionization rates, with the exception of fuels, tend to be higher than in most other sectors of the private sector economy. led first and foremost by the transmission, distribution, and storage sector. Next slide. As I mentioned, we added a chapter this year to try to give some insight into the 5-year trends after putting this report out since we first gathered the data back in 2015. Energy jobs are changing, and one of the ways that they're changing and have changed is drawn out by this comparison, that today 3.3 million Americans go to work every day producing and distributing the fuels and electricity that power our lives, while at the same time, almost 5 million Americans who work in energy efficiency and motor vehicles are spending their day trying to use that energy more efficiently. Next slide. And that's created a lot of dynamic and changes in both technology and skills needs. So here we have Mike Mulvaney, who's the Director of Energy and Infrastructure for the United Associations of Plumbers and Fitters, talking about the genesis of workforce within their union and their apprenticeship program, and how the recruitment of apprentices is more difficult today, but very frequently people don't realize that pipeline welders can make between $150,000 to $200,000 a year. But at the same time that they are doing that work, Mike observes we're also seeing big increases in energy efficiency technologies. We're just in the first or second inning of smart buildings. So this is the kind of dynamic way in which energy jobs are changing, both by producing energy and then by how we try to reform how we use that energy. Next slide. So here's another slide that demonstrates this. On the left, you can see what's been going on since 1990 in our economy. GDP keeps growing on an upward curve. And in the meantime, during that same time frame, starting in 1990, you've seen the energy intensity of our gross domestic product head in exactly the opposite direction. So some people might conclude that that would be a terrible thing for the energy sector of the economy. But in fact, it's been part of the dynamic that has caused this sector to outperform the economy as a whole. So during those last 5 years, we've seen energy production and distribution add 250,000 new jobs. We've seen GDP energy intensity decrease by 8%. And we've seen energy efficiency and fuel efficiency, when you combine them in that 5-year period, added almost 500,000 new jobs. So almost 750,000 new jobs over that period of time created by this striving for both cheaper energy production and greater energy efficiency at the same time. Next slide. So over the last 5 years, what have been the overall accomplishments? Oil and gas fuels, when you add it all up, created 73,000 new jobs, rose by 9%. Coal fuels lost 17,000 jobs over that period, a decline of 18%. You'll notice almost all of that happened at the front end of this 5-year period. It's been pretty stable recently because of the concentration on metallurgical coal and some other things. Overall, ethanol and biofuels have declined by 3,600 jobs, with corn ethanol down by about 12,000 jobs, while various biofuels are up by 65%. So a real change back and forth there. And lastly, we'd note that mining and extraction jobs comprise 55% of all fossil fuel jobs, and they're highly concentrated in specific states. So as we think about the impacts of the current economic downturn, it's certainly something to remember about the economic concentration that affects all of us differently in this particular time. Next slide. In electric power generation, two notable shifts have occurred that are helping to give us some insight into what's gone on with jobs. On the left, you'll notice that over these last 5 years, natural gas displaced coal as the largest net power generator, and you can see the upward march of those light green bars. And the other significant event is that within the renewable sector, Wind, again, those green bars marching up, displaced hydro as the largest producer of electric power within the renewable sector. Next slide. And so this, of course, reflected what happened in terms of jobs over the last 4 years. And this slide, we're only looking at 4-year totals because the first U.S. energy employment report we did not look into the different fossil fuel generation sources. And so in the 4-year period, electric power generation added 52,000 jobs, mostly in natural gas, wind, and combined heat and power. Coal generation lost 18,000 jobs, as mentioned, while natural gas overall, when you use both low emissions and conventional, just under 122,000. As mentioned, wind is the largest renewable in net generation and second in employment to solar at 115,000. Solar added jobs this last year, but over the 4-year period declined from its peak. Next slide. In transmission, distribution, and storage over this period of time, TDS added 156,000 new jobs. These new jobs were being driven by the expanding oil and gas production, by the expanding renewables deployment, and by quite a number of grid modernization, smart grid, and storage demand. And it would be important to note that battery storage alone added almost 19,000 jobs during that period. Next slide. Energy efficiency, of course, when you look at it over the 5-year period, added over 400,000 jobs. Traditional HVAC employers produced the largest sector of new jobs, almost 78,000. That's interesting because it tells you that it's the traditional HVAC employers that are adopting the new technologies. These aren't companies that are simply exclusively focused on high efficiency work, but they're the ones who are creating the most jobs by adopting those technologies. Efficient lighting added 52,000 jobs. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we were very excited to draw this connection between job creation and the Energy Star standards. Next slide. Energy efficiency, you can see what went on in the different industry sectors. We did experience a lot of hiring difficulty in the construction side of energy efficiency. You can see that there was actually a net job loss in the construction sector early on, although it's snapped back ever since. You can see that the most jobs that were created in energy efficiency over this period was in professional services, which added 113,000 jobs. Next slide. And so fuel in the motor vehicles and component parts sector, you get a demonstration of how fuel efficiency and electrification have been driving job growth during this period of time. So the motor vehicle sector added 134,000 new jobs over that 5-year period. 95,000 of them were in manufacturing, large majority. Alternative fuel vehicles now employ 266,000. They added 76,000 new jobs in that 5-year period. All electric vehicles were the most of those alternative fuels, making up 36,000. And as mentioned, 494,000 of these jobs directly contribute to fuel efficiency. Next slide. And that concludes our overview of what went on in the 2020 U.S. Energy and Employment Report. And now I'd like to turn it over to our great colleague and friend from BW Research, Phil Jordan, to make a few observations about these trends. Phil? Thanks so much, David, and congratulations to both Davids. I think this is the first webinar I've been on this week as we're all transitioning to a work-at-home economy where there haven't been dogs barking or children screaming. And because I have multiple of those, each of those in my house, I will make my comments very brief to try to continue that trend.
I did want to just thank EFI and NASIO, as well as all of the folks on the phone today. We're really pleased with the 5-year effort. And I just wanted to make a couple of very brief notes in highlight of Dave's excellent overview of the data. The first is just to sort of talk about how dramatic some of these job gains are over the last 5 years. The first is that 5% of all new jobs created in the US over that 5-year period are connected to energy efficiency and or fuel efficiency. And that's just, 1 out of every 20 jobs created over 5 years, I think was an important number to draw out. As Dave mentioned in his slides, wind surpassed hydropower as the largest producer of renewable energy this year, adding 16,000 jobs over 5 years. And also just want to note that this is before really any significant activities in offshore wind, which is obviously a major expansion opportunity currently, particularly along the eastern seaboard. In addition to the nation's first and currently only offshore wind platform in Block Island in Rhode Island, we're seeing lots of new procurements in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts. There's a lot of excitement and a lot of potential job growth over the coming years there. And then finally, as Dave mentioned, some really significant growth in battery storage, 38% growth over the 5-year period in battery storage. And a lot of that really has been connected to activity of the Tesla gigafactories and related supply chain activities there. So where the gigafactory is a huge opportunity for this job growth and has created lots of jobs in a few, sort of more isolated geographic areas, suggesting that there's an even greater potential for more job growth going forward. So just wanted to pull out those few points before I turn it back over. And again, just thank you everyone for this presentation, and thank you all for joining today. And we look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, everyone, this is Natalie again. I'll go ahead and take over for the question and answer segment, and I'll invite our presenters to answer them. So our first question is, which of the 5 sectors do we think examined in the report are most likely to be affected by the current economic crisis / COVID-19?
Well, absolutely. This is Dave Foster. Absolutely, the fuel sector is going to be and already is being dramatically impacted. I wouldn't necessarily attribute all of that to the COVID virus. It was already starting as a result of some of the battle between various oil suppliers and the price war that was kicked off, I believe, by Saudi Arabia and Russia. But certainly when travel falls, then fuel consumption drops very, very rapidly as well. So those two are compounding factors. And I certainly think that is going to be one that is deeply and immediately impacted. The electric power generation, perhaps less so, but an awful lot of our electricity is consumed by non-residential customers. And so when industrial demand for both electricity and fuels drop, then that means the production of whatever fuel is being used to drive it, or if it's renewables and they're relying on construction projects, I think we can expect to see some declines there. I was speaking to somebody in the United Mine Workers yesterday who told me that every single one of their coal mines was shut down on that particular day. So you can see that it will ripple through other parts of the energy economy as well. But that, I think, is all the more reason why looking at how energy intersects with the rest of our economy, we see that investments in energy can help make the rest of the economy far more efficient and so far more prosperous and far more competitive. And that's why, in my view, investments in energy infrastructure right now could be one of the more consequential things that we do to bring America back to economic health. And Phil, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, yeah, I think I would just add in that, there were some recent closures just announced today that at least temporarily the U.S. plants for GM and Ford and Chrysler will be closing. I think manufacturing, from a value chain perspective, I think manufacturing could be particularly impacted. I would imagine that many of the residential retrofits for energy efficiency may be on hold for a while as people are more selective about who comes into their house and social distancing. I'm sort of looking at the data, the economic data, and sort of wondering what are the segments that really won't be impacted. And it's hard for me to find too many that would be completely isolated. But I do think that given what we're seeing in the motor vehicle sector already around plant closures, and also some of the very aggressive incentives that were announced today to get people into automobiles, I have particular concern about manufacturing, in particular auto manufacturing. And so I just got a note from Natalie that because of the bandwidth issues, that she may be experiencing some technical difficulties, and that if the application crashes, to please email her the questions. So I'm not sure, Natalie, if you're able to, if your audio is working, but it does seem that we are getting some technical difficulties. So if folks could email questions to Natalie, we can try to process those in order.
All right, I'm fortunately back on. I'm so sorry about that, everyone. Let me go ahead and pull up our other questions. Sorry, unfortunately the application had to restart on my end. So Phil, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks.
Great. So we have a question from Peter Baer, reporter at E&E News. He asks, does the research indicate likely consequences of a severe economic downturn or recession on zero carbon jobs? Overall, are zero carbon jobs, excluding energy efficiency and natural gas, accelerating, stagnant, or shrinking? Are there significant bottlenecks that could back clean energy deployment? And if we could, there's another element to that question. He's asking if we could define a low emissions gas. And again, if you'd like me to break that question down, please let me know.
Yeah, well, I don't have the list right in front of me on the definition of low emissions gas, but when you pull the report down, you will see in the appendix that a lot of these terms, I hope we got all the terms we used, put into a definitions index in the appendix, and you will see the exact definition of the technologies that we include in low emissions gas, but it basically includes combined cycle and a number of other technologies, which, as I'm sure the questioner understands, have made a very significant contribution to how the emissions have been reduced in the electric power sector over the last decade.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in terms of the consequences of a significant economic disruption on zero carbon jobs, I think as Dave mentioned in his previous response, and as I suggested, I think there are going to be impacts across a wide variety of a large swath of the value chain and many of the technologies. There's nothing necessarily that in the data that we see at this point that would suggest any particular vulnerability for zero carbon jobs as opposed to any other jobs. In fact, this may in some cases accelerate some transition just based on some state responses in particular. I would just, to the other question about the differences between zero carbon jobs or clean energy jobs or other advanced energy jobs, low carbon jobs, and their traditional energy counterparts. We have seen, particularly in the past year, we have seen an uptick, again, because of the rebound in the solar industry, and and continued sustained growth in energy efficiency, that it's a substantial number of jobs that have been created, and nearly all of the zero carbon jobs are growing at or adding jobs at a rate faster than the overall economy. So that's not to say that other energy jobs are not. Energy jobs in general are, but those jobs are growing at what we consider to be a healthy pace. So I think we got all of the different questions in there between the two of us. Hopefully we answered those.
Yep, I think we did. All right. And do we have any more questions from the audience? Again, just use the question feature on GoToWebinar. If you have a question that comes to you later, you can also email me at nmvolk@energyfuturesinitiative.org. I'll give people another minute or two to submit their questions.
Well, while you're waiting, Natalie, maybe I'll make one final observation, which is really about some of the experience that all of us as Americans have gone through over the last dozen years or so, going back to when the Great Recession happened, and we last saw this kind of shuttering of automotive plants and wholesale shutdown of large parts of the economy. And it really ended up coming out of that, the investments that we made in revitalizing our energy sector were some of the most important ones that were made. And it really is, a portion of what led to this situation where we had declining costs for energy at the same time that we were at the same time introducing more energy efficient technologies. And it really is the kind of win-win situation that I think we look to in the future again. And that's why, to me, it's so important to emphasize that at a moment when Congress and the administration are looking at what to do in terms of an economic response, that at the very center of it, along with healthcare, should be investments in our energy sector, because they ripple through into creating, as we pointed out, one of the most dynamic periods in the automotive industry history, did an awful lot in terms of creating good family supporting jobs within the infrastructure sector of energy. Likewise, opened up on the basis of new technologies, much cheaper ways of producing much lower carbon emitting energy across a whole wide range of technologies. And so crisis does beget opportunity. I'm a firm believer in that, but we need to look to the future and think about the importance of energy and the solutions that we come up with, both at the federal and state level.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have two more questions. One from Andrew McAllister, who's the Canada Energy Commissioner and chair of NASIO's board. He wanted to extend a hearty thank you to both NASIO and EFI for taking the baton on this work to ensure its continuity, to the states and partners for their financial and in-kind support, and for BW Research for doing doing the research. And so he had a question for you, Phil. You mentioned that we are on the front end of a transition to smart energy systems. Where are the future jobs likely to come as this happens?
That's a great question, and thank you, Andrew, for your leadership in this work as well. So I think the answer to that question is that it depends on where you are, right? So I'm sitting in Massachusetts and in New England, and I think it's fairly clear that there are three areas in the Northeast that are really going to be driving this sort of transition. There's offshore wind is clearly the big movement now for renewable energy production in the Northeast. Electrification of buildings and electrification of transportation. I would say generally as a national answer, it really is around energy efficiency and electrification of buildings and transportation generally. And then the renewable energy generation mix, I think, will really depend a lot on geography. So certainly there's lots of opportunity and runway for solar. Wind is continuing to grow on both land-based and offshore applications. I think there's some very new interesting technologies, and EFI actually has a terrific report called Clearing the Air about carbon capture and how that can be used, and some of the implications of that for low carbon fuel standards. So I think some of it certainly will depend on geography, but I think that there are several kind of interesting several interesting areas where there could be some significant growth. Would also just sort of mention that given the different responses that may be coming from the federal government and state governments around how to focus on stimulus if this recession does prolong and deepen, if that's actually what's here now, as many predict, which is that at a time of also very low interest rates, this may be an opportunity to reinvest in that smarter infrastructure for both transportation and the energy grid. So I think there's quite a bit of opportunity in terms of that transition.
All right. Thank you, Phil. We have one more question from Paige Donnelly. She's asking if the report includes crosstabs for diversity of employment within renewables specifically, whether that's year over year and over 5-year trends.
Well, we certainly have crosstabs on diversity in all technologies, and so you can certainly have those, and the 5-year trends do not go into that detail, but it's something that by downloading all the reports, at least for the last 3 years, I think you could get those diversity trends across all different technologies. We didn't have them done at that level of detail during the first 2 years, but at least definitely the year over year, and I believe 3-year trends, you can do that if they require a little detective work by comparing different reports. If that was the last question, Natalie, just on behalf of EFI, let me also extend our profound thanks for NASIO's partnership for David Terry and Sandy Fazeli over the last 3 years that we've been putting this report together. And of course, from the superb work that we've gotten from BW Research, from Phil and Ryan and Sarah and some of their other staff who I know have spent long hours putting these reports together. And certainly, I'm especially grateful that a project of this duration got the support of so many state offices, so many foundations over the years, and so many trade associations, from the American Wind Energy Association to the Solar Foundation to the nuclear energy industry. An awful lot of people came together to make this possible. And so, we certainly designed this originally to be of use during times like this. So we stand at your ready as well, and of course, especially those from the state agencies, if you're working on projects and making decisions and thinking about ways in which we can impact the employment of Americans, don't hesitate to call any of us. Thank you.